Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. By way of introduction, my name is David Nye, and I'm the Major Airports Manager at the Australian Airports Association. For technical assistance today, please contact Redback Support on 1800 733 416. If you'd like to listen to the webinar today through your phone instead, please dial in the number and the passcode that is listed in the chat box. Today, the AAA presents the webinar Wildlife Hazard Management for Regional Airports, presented by Jeff Follet, General Manager at Avisure. Today's webinar will cover the following topics: the importance of good record keeping and documentation, data collection and trend analysis, how it can improve your business performance, basic requirements for wildlife management in accordance with aircraft movements. The opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Jeff a question, please use the chat box, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen, just to the right of the cogwheel. After typing out your question, hit enter to submit. Questions will be answered by Jeff throughout the webinar, so keep the questions coming and Jeff will respond accordingly. Before we start, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Jeff for his participation today. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeff to start off the webinar. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, David. I guess I'd like to just take the chance to say thanks to David and thanks to the Australian Airports Association, and thanks Redback in advance for what inevitably happens with technology. I'm sure there'll be a couple of snafus and we'll just pick them up as we go. So like David mentioned, we're going to catch up today about wildlife hazard management at regional airports. And as David mentioned, I'll try to pick up the questions as I go. Feel free to type them into the chat box. If I can pull them into the slides that I'm currently covering, I'll cover them at that point. Otherwise, I'll pick up anything I miss at the end there. I usually keep the presentations pretty informal, so like I said, just chime in where you can, and as much as we possibly can in this venue, we'll try to make it a bit of a discussion. See if I can get the slide to advance here. There we go. So just to give you an idea of where we're heading today, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of Avisure, our company, and me, Jeff. And for those who don't know us, just give you a little bit of background on where our knowledge sits, and give you a little bit of confidence in what we're presenting today. What I'd like to do is I'd actually like to use a strike event from here at a regional airport here in Australia to talk to those points that David mentioned. So we will be talking about record keeping and documentation, data analysis and trends and things like that, your requirements as an airport operator, and then we've chucked in a little bit of a bonus here that wasn't in the dot points about the presentation, which is managing your liability. And all of those items have to do with managing your liability. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a court case to cover those and sort of give you a scenario and get you thinking about an actual event that happened here in Australia so that you can sort of put that documentation and record keeping in some sort of context. So we'll review the relevant information from the strike event that we're talking about, and I'll bring in a couple other case studies as well, not just this one from here in Australia. And we'll talk about the court findings and what it means for you managing your liability, your counsel's liability in some cases, if it's a private management service, your liability. These are the key points that I'd like to address today. And if at any point throughout the presentation or at the end of the presentation you feel like we haven't covered off these key points, then I'll bring them back in at the end of the presentation so we can review them. But if I haven't hit the key points, then please hit me with questions, because I want to ensure that these 9 points are really well covered with you. These are really your take-home messages from today. So first and foremost, what we'll find is documenting hazards is absolutely essential. Then once you document those hazards, you've identified them as a potential issue for you, you have to address them. Now, the way that you go about addressing that we'll talk about through this case study that we're going to use. There are various ways that you can address any hazard. And again, going back to, you just have to document how you're going about it and what your plan is. You have to implement the procedures that you have documented. Part of what we do as a company is we go out, we audit wildlife management programs at airports around the world. And one of the common themes that we find is sometimes the procedures that are documented in the Wildlife Hazard Management Plan or in the aerodrome manual, they actually aren't followed. And as far as liability goes, that's a key issue for you and something that you'll see in the case study that we discussed today. You have to enact recommendations. So again, keep this in mind as we go through, and we'll come back to it at the end, but enacting your recommendations or documenting your progress toward them or the reasons that you may not be enacting recommendations is extremely important. You have to have an action plan for anything that's identified. You really have a duty of care for the safety of the people that use your aerodromes. And again, throughout the case studies that we use today, you'll see where that duty of care comes into play and how it plays into your liability. Insufficient funds is something that we hear quite often. So we simply didn't have the money to do something, or it's not operationally possible. Now, the danger with that is sometimes that works in specific law cases, but insufficient funds doesn't actually get you out of your obligations around the manual of standards. And so while in some cases insufficient funds may get you across the line, in the end it's not a reason to not do what you're supposed to do according to the manual of standards. We need to view the manual of standards and other regulations as the minimum standard. What we'll find as we go through these cases today is that even if you can tick a box against many of the regulations, sometimes that's actually not enough to address your liability issues. And then dot points 8 and 9, we're talking about what your priorities should be. So you want to manage for risk, not for compliance. Compliance is something that you have to do, but you really want to view each hazard or the risk that's presented by wildlife in this case, and you want to manage for that, not simply just for ticking a box there. I think some people attended the operations, the op swap that just happened, and I know that was a discussion that our team had with some of the people regarding the apps that are out there, and people looking for the green tick that they've done it, but not necessarily understanding that the green tick isn't just what we're looking for. We actually want to address the hazard that's in front of us. That second priority there is managing your liability. And this means documenting that you have a good safety culture. You're predictive in the way that you deal with things. You're not just constantly reacting to what's being thrown at you. Now, all of these key points, one of the things that happens sometimes is we preempt the whole thing. We look at a situation and we determine at the very beginning that it's not an issue. And the instant that somebody decides that something's not an issue, they don't throw resources at it and they don't actually address the hazard. So as we go through this, when we're documenting hazards and we're reporting our activities and we're looking at trend analysis, we don't want to preemptively judge anything. And the other part of that is we don't want to preemptively judge that we don't have the money, time, resources to do something. The best approach in these scenarios is to take a look at what the hazards are, take a look at what the risk is that's being presented to you, and then come up with solutions. And then once you come up with the solutions, work through what's feasible and what's not feasible. But if you start from a it's not feasible, it's really hard to come up with solutions to problems. So a little bit about Avasure. We're a worldwide company. We're based here on the Gold Coast in Queensland. For those of you down south, it's absolutely beautiful here. Blue skies, sunny. I just want to chime that in there. So we have offices around the world. We've got a great program over in Vancouver. It is a 24 hours a day, 7 days a week operation. We run their wildlife management program for them. That's sort of the one end of the spectrum of what Avasure does. The other end of the spectrum is something as simple as coming out to an aerodrome and doing some training, which might only take 1 or 2 days, and competency checks and things like that. In between those two things, we conduct surveys, we do risk assessments, we develop wildlife hazard management plans, we develop procedures, we do all sorts of things. We've worked for 90 airports worldwide at this point. Myself, Jeff, I've had the opportunity. I actually started with our sister company, EcoSure, which is an environmental consultancy, and I started by chasing ibis off landfills with a stock whip and other tools. So that's where I started. I've been on aerodromes conducting active management, so I've been in the vehicle trying to safely keep aircraft and wildlife away from one another. I've also had the opportunity to travel with AAA. I've been to Oman in the Middle East, Singapore, New Zealand to conduct various audits and wildlife hazard assessments and surveys and things like that. So I've had quite the opportunity over the past 7 years to see quite a few different programs and quite a few different approaches, and I'll try to bring that in and see if any of that can apply directly to your situations at your aerodrome. The case that we're going to use today as the basis of our discussion happened at a regional court here in Australia. I like using Australian examples because then the people in attendance can really understand the issues that came up. So in this case, many people understand eastern grey kangaroos here in Australia. In this case, we believe it was a juvenile based on the photograph, and it was a general aviation aircraft operating a private flight with visual flight rules. The incident happened around midday. Basically what happened is the kangaroo came from off runway, crossed the runway in front of the aircraft, resulting in a strike. Luckily, no human injuries. The kangaroo did not fare too well and died from its injuries. And in the end, the results for the aircraft and the individual that owned the aircraft, we had a leading edge of the right wing that was damaged, as well as a chip propeller. An estimated cost of about $160,000 in damages. So, as is often the case with these sort of situations, everybody thought that it was somebody else's issue and somebody else's problem and somebody else's fault. They weren't able to come to a resolution just amongst themselves, and so, as often happens, lawyers got involved and there was a court case. This case is the case that I may use to get to the dot points that David and I spoke about around documentation, recording, trend analysis, your liability and your requirements. So as we go through this case, and feel free, you can jot it down on a piece of paper next to you there. If you're really game, you can jot it into the comment recorder here. I want you to take a side in this court case. So I want you to either be the plaintiff in this case, the aircraft operator, or I want you to be the defendant. I want you to be the the airport operator. Given that I imagine the audience here is predominantly airport managers, airport people, I'm guessing that there's going to be quite a few people that fall on the defendant's side. But the reason I want you to take a side in this is to think through what do you need to know in this case to understand whose fault it actually is, and how would you go about answering the questions of whose fault it is? How would you go about gathering the information that you need? Because in the end, if an incident like this happens at your aerodrome, this is the sort of investigative stuff that you're going to need to be able to do. Now, my purpose today isn't to tell you all of the things that you need to record after an incident. The reason I'm using this case is actually to have you thinking about what do you need to know in advance. If you know what you need to know in advance, you can actually start to be preemptive and start to work on having that safety culture around preventing incidents rather than reacting to incidents. So, a bit of relevant information from the court case. So we look at U.S. strike data and damaging strikes specifically, and we can see that of total strikes, 2% were terrestrial strikes. Now, that in and of itself doesn't sound like a very large number, but 30% of terrestrial strikes are damaging. Oftentimes, those are large animals, and so if you've looked at the equations around energy and what the likelihood is of damage or the consequence of a strike, the larger the animal, more likely that there would be damage to the aircraft. And of that 30%, we have 13% of all damaging strikes are terrestrial. So given that, depending on how many strikes you've taken a look at in your history, just based on anecdote, not too often compared to birds do you see terrestrial strikes, but they can be damaging. When we look at Australia, it's similar in that terrestrial animals account for 3% of total strikes. So we're basically on par with the U.S. data. Having said that, 18% of terrestrial strikes are damaging, and 6% of damaging strikes are terrestrial. Now, if we look specifically at macropods, which is the case for this incident, somebody in my team described them in maybe not the nicest terms, but we find that they're particularly stupid animals. This is based on the damaging strike. So you can see 78% is quite a large number. We look at terrestrial strikes 2.5 times more likely to cause damage. That's that bit that I was talking about, the generally larger animals. And macropods in particular, 2.5 times more likely to cause damage than other terrestrial animals. And so when you have macropods on your aerodrome, so macropods in this case, wallabies, kangaroos, things like that, the chances of having a damaging strike are quite high. Now, just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this court case, because it's going to be relevant. Then we have some statistics around hull losses and fatalities. And I guess the main point here is I've talked all about how terrestrial strikes oftentimes cause damage, but you'll see that they aren't particularly high when it comes to hull losses and fatalities. And that has to do with where and when terrestrial animals are struck. So generally speaking, the aircraft is moving at a slower speed. And generally speaking, well, they're on the ground unless a kangaroo happens to jump off the ground or something like that. But that's why we don't see the rates being quite high for hull losses or fatalities. So when looking at the court case, I'm going to start from the specifics. So when an incident like this happens, generally what happens with an investigation is we start with what's right in front of us. So I'm going to start from what's right in front of us, and you'll see that we sort of expand out and we gather more evidence over time, and we start to look at a larger time scale and a larger landscape. So if we look at exactly what happened on the day of the incident, the days leading up to the incident, the AROs had conducted serviceability inspections and wildlife counts. The kangaroos were documented, their presence was there. Not only that, but there was documentation of dispersal actions. And so when we talk about documentation and recording, the AROs on the ground were actually doing a very good job of recording what was going on at the time. Having said that, one of the serviceability inspections noted that kangaroo numbers were increasing to dangerous levels and noted that a NOTAM should be issued. But in the end, that NOTAM wasn't issued, and that's important information for later on. And don't go and change which side you're on as I go here. I can see what's happening already. Nobody publicly put it out there, but I can see that happening. So before the pilot left the departure port, the pilot actually checked the IRSA and checked for any NOTAMs that might be relevant. The IRSA in this case noted that the kangaroo hazard exists, and it gave an ARO mobile phone number. So with that information, when the pilot looked at the IRSA, the pilot also automatically went to go and check for a NOTAM just to see what was going on at the time. The pilot chose not to contact the ARO via the mobile number, but when the pilot went and did the flight, the pilot did an overfly of the runway, had a look, checked the wind sock, I should say, and had a look around for some kangaroos. The pilot had flown into this port over 20 times, and so the pilot was familiar with the aerodrome, and that's a bit of relevant information as well. And having said that, the pilot in the court case indicated that he had never seen a roo present in any of those 20 times at the airport. So when we step back a little bit from the incident, as things went on and as lawyers got involved and as expert witnesses got involved, you can see that serviceability inspections for the past 10 years had identified kangaroos as a hazard. Technical inspection reports from various consultants indicated that kangaroos were a hazard and that a fence needed to be installed. Asset audit reports indicated that kangaroos were an issue and that a fence needed to be installed. The Wildlife Hazard Management Plan that was developed by the aerodrome indicated that kangaroos were a hazard. The En-route supplement, Supplement Australia, indicated right there kangaroo hazard exists, And there were also emails and letters from various pilots indicating that they were concerned about the kangaroos. And in fact, in one case, the air ambulance had noted with the aerodrome operator that they would stop flying to the aerodrome based on the hazard presented by kangaroos. And the airport, in response, provided the number for the ARO, and for the air ambulance, they were meant to call the ARO to conduct what were called RU runs anytime an air ambulance was going to arrive. So it was very clear that kangaroos were identified as a hazard. So with this, the aerodrome operator, the aerodrome operator understood that kangaroos were a hazard and therefore put in some mitigation measures. So there were airside inspections, serviceability inspections. They were meant to actually increase their inspections when numbers of kangaroos were on the rise. There was a presence of an aerodrome reporting officer at night. So they provided the phone number for the aerodrome reporting officer to go out and conduct that RU run before anybody arrived. They conducted grass flashing. So this is a double-edged sword in that the short grasses were attractive for foraging opportunities for the RUs, but the idea there was to slash it down to short grass in order to be able to see the RUs that were in close proximity to the runway. They had the IRSA in place, they had developed a wildlife hazard management plan, and in addition, they had installed an electric fence. So the fence that was around this aerodrome at the time is basically a cattle fence, and what they did is they installed an electric fence on the inside of that cattle fence, so on the air side of the cattle fence. Now, at the time of this incident, sort of going backwards again, there wasn't an ARO present at the time of the flight. The pilot knew that the AROs, being familiar with the site, knew that the AROs weren't always present, and so assumed that the ARO actually wouldn't know the current situation when it came to kangaroos. The pilot also indicated that he understood that the AROs couldn't just go out there for any flights, that it turns out that the airport operator didn't have funds to send the ARO out there all the time, and so it was only really for the air ambulance that was an option. And the IRSA didn't explain how the mobile phone should be used. It just simply stated that kangaroo hazard exists, ARO can be contacted at with the phone number. It didn't indicate that kangaroo hazard exists, we will issue a NOTAM around increased numbers, or for current situation, please contact ARO at, or ARO is available for runway inspections prior to arrival, call on this number. The aerodrome has all sorts of obligations. In this case, it was a registered aerodrome rather than a certified aerodrome, and so there are differences in the requirements around that. But in the end, the MOF states that if regular monitoring confirms that a hazard exists, something needs to be done about it, and it needs to be documented either in a wildlife hazard management plan or in the aerodrome manual. Specifically around registered aerodromes, if there's an issue, they're expected to complete safety inspection reports, which clearly identify what the corrective actions are and ways to implement those necessary improvements. The advisory circular goes on to state that that registered aerodromes are required to monitor wildlife activity, and where a hazard is identified, they recommend that there are written procedures. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a wildlife hazard management plan, but that there are procedures in place. The deed for the aerodrome, so the aerodrome was handed over to the council to run, and that deed provided the stipulation that full financial responsibility was for the council who runs the aerodrome, and that the operator, in this case the council, was responsible for taking action to prevent any activities that might create hazards, and this includes birds and other wildlife. And based on all of this, the airport actually went and sought federal funding, a grant, in order to install a proper kangaroo-proof fence. Unfortunately, with the change of governments and things like that, the funding fell through. And so at that time, the aerodrome operator wasn't able to install the fence, but didn't document the ways in which they were still going to move forward with addressing this issue without that grant funding. So, court case, in the end, for those of you, again, nobody's publicly stated which side they're on yet, but the judge found on behalf of the plaintiff in this case, the aircraft operator, and provided $195,000, almost $196,000. So that covered the cost of the damages to the aircraft as well as the time and interest in not having the aircraft serviceable. And the court reasoning for this was that the kangaroos were clearly identified and documented as a hazard. The council, in the end, based on the Civil Liability Act, had a duty of care to ensure safety. And this was an interesting bit. They said that the council actually didn't have an obligation to provide an airport as a service to its community. It's not like sewage or roads or anything like that. And the council had chosen as a service to provide this to their community. And by doing so, by choosing to provide this service for their community, they are then responsible for ensuring that that's a safe aerodrome. And so this would likely apply to, I would suggest, all of the regional aerodromes here in Australia, that it's not an obligation, it's actually a service to the community, and therefore it's an absolute requirement, whether you have the money or not, that you keep your aerodrome safe for users. There was also the issue around duty of care, and so the judge found that there was a breach in the duty of care, and the basis for this was that the increasing numbers that were described as dangerous level should have moved to the procedure around implementing a NOTAM and issuing that, and the pilot would have known that this was an issue. They failed to comply with their own procedures. In this case, they were meant to continue doing their inspections, but it actually also increased them based on the trend. Continue doing their inspections, but it actually also increased them based on the trends, the data that they were collecting. When asked about this, the airport operator said, well, it's obvious that the kangaroos are a hazard, so we don't see the point in doing the count. Now, first of all, it's documented in the procedures that you must do it, that you do it, I should say. And therefore, you're obligated to do it if you have it written in your procedures. Second of all, just because something is an obvious hazard doesn't mean that you should stop monitoring it. In fact, it means that you should continue monitoring it, if not more regularly, so that you can better understand it and better manage it. They failed to cull wildlife, so they didn't actually go out and remove any of the kangaroos by shooting or other means. And in the end, they failed to create a kangaroo-proof fence, which was documented in various reports, audits, and things like that. The judge determined that the collision was foreseeable. There was enough information that the kangaroos were present to suggest that they're near enough to the runway to be struck. In fact, there was documented evidence in an email and letter that at night, some people had seen aircraft going down the runway and turning back and forth with its headlights in order to see kangaroos before taking off. And the risk was not insignificant. So this goes back to that data that I was showing right at the very beginning. Terrestrial animals cause damage quite often in strikes. And so the risk is actually quite significant. And the precautions that were necessary weren't burdensome. And the judge in this case specifically pointed to the issuance of a NOTAM. It's not particularly burdensome for the airport to do that. And so when we think about dot points around record keeping, documentation, data analysis, your requirements, and the managing of your liability, you can see that those are all very, very clearly part of the court reasoning in why the aerodrome operator was actually the one that was responsible. Now, it's not just here in Australia. So I'm going to give you a court case from South Africa. In this case, cute little guy over there on the side, a warthog. It wasn't based on the national regulations. It was based on the International Civil Aviation Organization. So where national regulations are insufficient, lawyers will very quickly go up the chain to ICAO. In this case, very similar to Australia, the airport had a duty of care. In this case, though, it was quite interesting that the airport had an animal-proof fence. It was quite a big fence. However, the fence had breaches, as many aerodromes here in Australia have, whether it be hares or foxes or rabbits or wallabies getting in underneath the fence. And it was very reactionary. They would go out and they'd just chuck some rocks in the hole. The aerodrome argued that there really aren't any incidents with warthogs, and so they're here sometimes, but really the chances of striking it are pretty low. The court argued that just the fact that they struck one basically negates that argument, that if you've struck one on the aerodrome, obviously they can get inside the fence. And therefore, it was foreseeable that the animal could access the airport and could be struck. The airport tried to argue that they had fulfilled their compliance, they fulfilled the regulations, they had a fence, tick, we've done it. And in this case, and probably in other cases that I'll ask David if I can send out a PDF of a document that has further evidence of a similar sort of case. But in this case, it wasn't just simply putting up a fence, setting, forgetting, and walking away. It's actually the procedures around checking the fence and ensuring that there aren't breaches and ensuring that you've fulfilled your duty of care. The idea that we simply didn't think that it would happen is an insufficient response. And you really need to do more than just we've put up a fence. There's another case from Italy, and the case from Italy. There we go. As we go through the key points here, I just want to bring up one more case, and this is the one I'll check with David if I can send through as a PDF afterwards. In this case, it was a flock of gulls, and what stands out to me is that the judge found that there was shared responsibility. It was not just the aerodrome operator, but it was also the Ministry of Transport, the Civil Aviation Authority in this case, that was responsible. And specifically to airport operators, they said you must always follow the Aviation Authority regulations. When in doubt, you can go up the chain to ICAO. Prevention costs less than dealing with the incident after the fact. Once there's a burning hole on the ground, everybody wants to do something about it, but actually you should have done something beforehand. You really need to have documentary evidence that you've tried to prevent something from happening. And emphasizing the information that you provide to the flight crew. So this is one that particularly relates to the example here in Australia, where if they provided the information via the NOTAM, they probably would have had a better case to make in court that they had provided sufficient information and sufficient detail to the pilot before arriving. Whether that would actually hold up in court or not, I'm not sure, but at least you've followed your procedures. With that, I didn't see any questions come through as I was going through. If there are questions that are coming through, and maybe I'll just check with David and check with Redback to ensure that Gianna, to make sure that I haven't missed anything. I'm scrolling through the chat bar here and I don't see anything that stands out.
No, I can't see any at the moment.
Okay. And maybe I'll, just as far as procedural sort of things, David, I'll ask you the question around this PowerPoint. I was thinking we can provide as a PDF, and I can send through a couple documents around court cases. I'm not sure whether that would fit within the AAA website or how that might be done, but if people are interested.
Yeah, that's fine. It can be sent through to the team in our office, and then they will forward it to everybody that participated on the webinar.
Perfect.
Looks like there could be a question coming through from David Russell.
So just to make sure that everybody has that, can you pass any responsibility on to the Department of Parks and an interesting question. So one of the things that stood out in this Italy case is actually the responsibility of off-airport landholders. And here in Australia, we have the National Airport Safeguarding Framework. And I'm not certain that you would be able to pass responsibility on to them, but the important part is that you engage them as stakeholders in the conversation. And again, going back to that documentation, document your conversations with them and the reasons that they aren't able to provide you with a license to call. It's rather unusual, actually, because aircraft safety and personal safety, generally speaking, is a very strong case for getting authority to control or permit to call. So I'm surprised if the airport isn't able to get a license. And I also have our principal research director here in the room with me, Jeff McKee. And Jeff, did you have something to add to
that? Just coming back to the question, the basis of the question itself, I think theoretically the Department of Parks and Wildlife should be held responsible. Nominally, they're the authority over the wildlife. They claim authority over it, so they should have responsibility in that particular instance. In reality, though, good luck with that. There's probably no way in the world that you would ever win a case, I don't think, against the department under those circumstances.
David, can I just confirm that that answers the question for you, or is there additional information that we can provide?
Looks like there might be something coming through from Troy.
Perfect. See here from Troy. Hi, Jeff. Troy from Kempsey Airport just recently undertook culling, and NPWS were reluctant to issue tag to call. I need a little bit more information. Did they provide you with perhaps the case on why they're reluctant to issue the tag? Is it that they didn't feel like they had sufficient information on your plans, or was it that they had a particular concern about the regional population? Or those are the two reasons that I can think of that they might ask the question. Oftentimes with the permit to call, they require either a property management plan or a species action plan that lays out exactly what you've done prior to lethal control in order to justify the permit. Oftentimes they actually require an airport to demonstrate that they've tried all non-lethal means first and foremost, and then after the airport has documented that it's tried all non-lethal means, they issue the lethal permit. Lack of offense. Okay, so in that case, I would suggest that what their case would be, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is they would argue that you haven't tried all non-lethal means to keep the animals away from the airside area in order to allow you to have that permit to control. There are various ways that you might be able to approach that. You know, perhaps there is funding, and David, feel free to chime in either via chat or over the phone. I know AAA has worked quite hard on getting the government to support regional airport funding. Perhaps if I believe that Kempsey is owned and operated by the council there. If the council isn't able to find local funds, perhaps we can dial into some of that Commonwealth funding.
Yeah, that's a possibility. We'll be more than happy to have a look and see what what avenues there are to secure any funding. So yeah, keep the dialogue open on that one.
Yeah, I have to be honest, Troy. So Troy said lack of offense, that my interpretation was correct, and then he noted that he didn't get the tags required in the end. And my experience with Avasure receiving its permits to call, as well as assisting other airports to get their permits to call, the demonstration that you have fulfilled all of the non-lethal approaches is quite not onerous, but you really do need to prove that you've tried everything else before shooting. Oh, you did get the tags in the end. Okay, well done. I have to admit, I'm a little bit surprised. Oftentimes, they're quite rigorous in proving the non-lethal means. I thought I saw another comment bubble, but it seems to have disappeared. Are there other questions I can answer around systems for documentation? What's expected around trend analysis? Any additional discussion around the requirements that you have, whether that be via CASA or others? Or any more discussion around liability? Liability is a really interesting one. There's just a recent court case in the European Court of Justice and delays due to bird strikes, and quite a convoluted case in which an aircraft suffered an ingestion, and the technical inspections led to a delay of passengers, and the passengers took the airline to court for that. In the end, the passengers won the court case, but it wasn't directly due to the bird strike. It was actually due to the airline not following its procedures around technical, around engine inspections. So again, in court, it's not just airports that are held to their procedures, their documented procedures, but also airlines in this case.
We'll just give it a minute and see if there's any other questions coming through. It doesn't look to be. There doesn't look to be at the moment. So maybe I'll begin the wrap up, and if anybody obviously still has any questions in the next minute or couple of minutes, please feel free to drop them in, and Jeff will endeavour to answer them. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Jeff for his informative presentation today, and also to thank everybody that dialed in and participated in today's session. We'll now ask you just to take a moment to complete a short survey that you'll see coming up on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can ensure that you hit the orange submit button once you've completed all the questions, that'll be great. This webinar will be made available to members via the Airport Professional webinar page in the coming week, and it will also be emailed to everyone directly once available. We encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing our team at events@airports.asn.au. Further details of the next AAA webinar will be released in the next edition of Airport Alert, which will be going out tomorrow. And just a heads up, as it is next Wednesday, the 6th of June, and it's actually a webinar which will be by CASA, who will be providing an update on the post-implementation review of Part 139 of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations, including proposed changes to MOS Part 139. The speakers for this webinar will be Darren Angelo, the Acting Manager of Aerodrome Regulation, and Simon Adamson, the Project Manager, Regulatory Implementation. So a link to that webinar will be in the airport alert tomorrow. So those of you keen to understand more about that, we encourage you to register, and obviously anybody else in your airport that has an interest in MOS Part 139, please pass that information on and keep an eye on the airport alert as it comes out tomorrow. And obviously, if you would like any further information on any of the topics that we've covered or spoken about, again, please email the AAA events team at events@airports.asn.au. So I haven't seen any other questions come through. Are you all good with that, Jeff?
Yeah, and just thanks again to you guys, and thanks to everyone that attended. If you have any questions, I think my after this, I think my contact details are available via the invite. Otherwise, I'll send them through to you, David, and that can go out with PDF as well.
Okay, no problem. Again, thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks everybody for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.